Hey everybody, welcome to week 1 of Principles of Economics, Econ 304. Today we are going to go through the first chapter, which is titled Welcome to Economics. It's a little brief overview of what economics is and kind of what to expect from the class. It should be a pretty brief chapter. I'll be going through slides almost identical to the ones on Canvas that are from the textbook, and my job is to help explain them. As I go through, let me know and feel free to make comments in the discussion thread on Canvas about what you might have more questions on or want some clarification on. But otherwise, let's get started. All right, so here we go. This first set of slides looks at chapter 1 in the textbook, but first I'll talk about a little bit of what the expectations are for the class. And so the plan is to talk about what this class entails, expectations, responsibilities, goals, grades, and then we'll get into chapter 1, which is just an introduction to the basic concepts of economics. So first of all, the syllabus is all online. Everything is contained on your Canvas site. So if you haven't already, take a look at Canvas. There is a whole module, Module 0, that walks you through step by step how to familiarize yourself with the class, expectations, any contact information you might need, and organizes the rest of the semester. And so the syllabus and the calendar and outline of the class are all contained on Canvas. For the textbook is OpenStack's Principle of Microeconomics. It is a free online textbook. You can buy a copy if you're old school like me and you like paper. It's about 20 or 30 bucks on Amazon or another bookstore, but it's also available free in digital version online. And so that's a really great resource. So if you click the link through here, it'll take you to their online website where they have the textbook online, resources, lots of great things for students. Canvas is the primary way that we'll be interacting this semester. It's going to be our primary point of contact. It's going to be where assignments are completed and assigned. It's going to be where PowerPoint slides are loaded. It's also going to be where you can interact with your peers and with me through discussion threads and messaging. In terms of expectations, we both have responsibilities to each other. My responsibility is to respond to you, to provide you with an engaging and interesting way to learn economics, and your responsibility is to complete assignments in a timely fashion and communicate with me. And so I think the two most important factors in doing a class like this, an online course, is that you stay on top of your deadlines and don't let work build up, and then also that we communicate. And so if anything comes up at any time, please reach out to me. I'm around all the time, and I would love to help you with anything that you might be having troubles with or have questions about. So that's the basic overview of what the class is going to be like. Let's get started on Chapter 1, Welcome to Economics. So what we're going to talk about today is sort of what economics is and why we consider it important. We're going to talk about the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics, and then we're going to talk about how economists behave, and as scientists, how they use theories and models to help understand issues. And then we'll give a little overview of how economies and economic systems can be organized, looking at our example and other examples around the world. So let's get into it. First of all, what is economics? It's not just the study of money and finance. What it really is, it's the study of how humans make decisions in the face of scarcity. And scarcity is this idea that we have unlimited wants and needs, but constrained resources, right? There's not enough hours in the day, dollars in my wallet. Even things like the sunlight can be scarce, right? It goes away sometimes. And so economics is the study of how humans and firms and countries make decisions in the face of that scarcity. How do they choose how to allocate those scarce resources? And so we see that in family decisions, individual decisions, business decisions, and national or societal decisions, right? How do we allocate tax dollars? How do we allocate the time in our day? Do we want to work an extra hour or study an extra hour? Those kinds of questions. One of the big things, one of the big tools economists use is data. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about economic models. But economists use data to help them understand what's going on in the world right now and also make predictions about what might be going on in the future. And one great source of economic data is what's called the FRED website. And FRED is the St. Louis Federal Reserve website. And they have data on nearly 400,000 domestic and international economic and social variables over time, and we'll use them frequently in this class. This is data on prices, employment, financial information, home price information, energy price information, data on what kinds of education are being used in different careers, how countries compare in terms of their economics. And so it's really a great resource for everybody, but especially for students, especially economics students. So definitely take a chance and check that out. And we'll talk more about that data later on. In the social media age, in the advent of the internet with technology at our fingertips, it's really had an effect on economics, because what we'll find is that when we're deciding how to allocate these resources, information becomes really important. And social media and technology have completely changed the way we share information. It's really lowered what we call the cost or the price of information. You don't have to go to a library and look something up. Now you can just ask your smartphone or put it in a search engine like Google or DuckDuckGo and get a lot of information. And so that's really changed the way economists think about the world and given us a lot more opportunity. In terms of scarcity, when we think about it, scarcity is actually around us all the time. We interact with scarcity every day, Just this morning, my decision of what to do with my scarce time in the morning. Did I want to get out of bed early and get a fresh start? Did I want to take a leisurely cup of coffee? Did I want to watch a little bit of TV? I only have so much time, and so I have to make a decision about how to allocate my scarce time, just like you do. We also see scarcity around us in society. Issues like homelessness really put a stark definition of scarcity, right? That there's not enough money to go around, not enough jobs, not enough resources, not enough healthcare services, those kinds of things. And so think about some of the critical goods and services that you encounter or you make use of, and how scarcity affects the availability of them, whether it's getting your bills paid, having enough time to enjoy socializing with friends and family versus work versus school, or even scarcity in the face of how do I split up this pizza with my friends, right? It's all around us. So scarcity truly is all around us. And that's one of the great ways that economics really interacts with all of our regular daily choices. When we think about the study of economics, a lot of our basic principal ideas come from a philosopher named Adam Smith. And Adam Smith was kind of considered the first economist. And he had this idea of dividing labor into discrete tasks, what we call specialization. And a lot of his ideas were first written in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. And in it, Adam Smith talks about a lot of the big ideas in economics that we still talk about today. Things like the idea that markets benefit from people following their own self-interest, that markets organize themselves well, and that we actually get more of everything if we all focus on what we're good at. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about this idea of dividing labor into discrete tasks. And so you've got here a picture of Adam Smith. And when we talk about this idea of dividing labor into specific tasks, what we're really talking about is specialization, or the division of labor. And the division of labor is just the way in which different workers divide required tasks to produce a good or a service. So you can think about assembly line work, right? I do one part repeatedly, you do the next part, and then you do the next part, and then the next part. By specializing in only doing one thing, we can generally produce more of everything. And if you don't believe me, think about it this way. Where do you get most of your consumer goods? Think about getting a coat, right? If you need a jacket, you can get materials and sew the fabric. You can craft a button out of plastic or wood or stone, and then sew the buttons on, and then, press the fabric, cut the pattern, all of those steps. One person can do all of those steps. but it's very, very time consuming. It's easier to buy already produced fabric, buy already produced buttons, and then put them together and assemble them. That's one level of specialization. Or even easier and more cheaper, a lower cost way to produce that jacket would be to use a factory, right? Where one machine cuts the pattern, one machine cuts the fabric, one machine assembles the arm, the sleeve, puts the buttons on, and then packages it. And that's the way a lot of our consumer goods come to us, is through specialization. And that makes us much more efficient than when we think about sort of the deserted island version of it, where we have to do everything ourselves. That's a lot less efficient. And so think about things that you take for granted in your daily life, where someone else does some of the work to make it easier for you. I don't bake my own bread. I don't make my own clothes, and that's a form of specialization. I do one job, I teach, and then I take my money and I use it to buy goods that someone else has specialized in producing. And so when we think about economic growth and the economy, division of labor and specialization of labor is really important conceptually to that, right? It's this idea that we can make more by focusing on what we're best at. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So why does the division of labor increase production? The idea here is that by focusing on particular tasks for which we are well suited, we will increase overall production in the process. And that's what specialization says. And so the joke I like to tell here is, should Lizzo do her own taxes? She could, but is that the best use of her time? There's someone else who has specialized in doing taxes, a CPA or an accountant. And doesn't it make more sense for a superstar musician like Lizzo to pay someone else to do that than for her to do it, right? This idea of specialization says, hey, we each have unique skills and talents or areas of focus where we have experience, and we should focus on that. And by focusing on the tasks to which we're best suited, we're going to increase productivity. We're going to get the more of everything. Specialization is also important because it allows businesses to take advantage of what's called economies of scale. And this is another economics term. Economies of scale mean that for many goods, when we increase the level of production, we can lower the per unit price. And this gets back to the example of making a button. If I wanted to make a button, I could. I could get clay, or I could get bone or wood, and I could carve it or form it and cook it or bake it. And it would be a very time-consuming process. For me to make one button, I would probably spend a day. It would be heinous, not efficient. But a button factory can churn out hundreds of thousands of buttons a day because of that specialization and that economy of scale. By spending a lot of money on one big button making machine, you become way more efficient at productivity, and it lowers the per unit cost over time. So me making one button by hand, maybe it's not very expensive in terms of machinery, but it's very expensive in terms of my time. Whereas a machine churning out thousands of buttons per unit is very cheap. And that's what we mean by economies of scale. And it gets back to this idea of specialization and taking advantage of technology. So hopefully that makes sense. Economies of scale is one of those economic concepts. It comes up a lot over and over again. And so if you have questions about economies of scale, go ahead and enter into the discussion threads over there on Canvas and let me know what you're thinking of, what might be an example of economies of scale, or what questions you might have about it. Okay? The next thing we want to talk about is the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Generally, all economics is concerned with the well-being of people, people with jobs, people without jobs, people with high income, people with low income, all general society. We call them actors, right? Businesses, firms, countries, individuals. Microeconomics focuses on the actions of individual agents within the economy: workers, households, individuals, firms. Micro, zoomed in, personal level. That's what micro means. So we're going to be, in this class, focusing on microeconomics, the decision-making of individual people and firms. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, looks at the big picture. broad issues like economic growth, unemployment, inflation, and trade that affect countries, nations, and regions. So it's the zoomed out big picture is the macro view, and the micro view is the zoomed in personal, firm, and individual level view. So we'll be talking about microeconomics in this class. Macroeconomics just takes a different set of tools to look at slightly broader problems and questions. Okay? Other ideas and concepts in economics, and these are generally macroeconomic concepts, but monetary policy and fiscal policy are two terms that come up a lot. You've probably heard it, especially around election time. People will start talking about monetary policy and fiscal policy, or right now where we're going through some economic turmoil. And monetary policy is just economic policy that's determined by a central bank, and it involves changing the interest rate to try and control the availability of credit in the economy. And it's one of the levers that macroeconomists use to try and speed up or slow down the economy, depending on how we feel like the economy is doing. So, for example, if we're in a period of higher inflation, we can use monetary policy to raise interest rates and decrease the availability of credit in the economy to try and slow the economy down. And if this is something that's interesting to you, then you're definitely going to want to check out Principles of Macroeconomics, because we'll talk about it a lot there. Same can be said for fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the same general idea, but instead of it being the central bank, it's the legislative body. So in our case, Congress, right? And in this case, what they're talking about is using taxes and government spending to affect the economic outlook. And so both monetary policy and fiscal policy are looking at trying to manage the macroeconomy, but it's using two different tools. Monetary policy is using interest rates, and fiscal policy is government spending and taxes. And they're both big macroeconomic concepts. So if that's something you're super duper interested in, you should check out Principles of Macro. Okay? Cool. The next section we want to talk about is how economists use theories and models to understand economic issues. One of the most influential economists in modern times was John Maynard Keynes, and that's a picture of him right there. And Keynes taught us that economics teaches you how to think, not what to think. So in economics, a lot of times we'll talk about what the theories say and what some of the research or evidence might say. But just like any good science, economics is a social science, and so we don't usually have definitive answers about things. We have things we generally agree on, but we're constantly testing our theories and modeling relationships to try and get a better sense of how the world really works. And you know, you are out in the world. Things do not always go the exact same way. And so we use theories and models to try and understand economic issues and answer these questions, knowing full well that there might not be just one answer. So, one of the biggest tools in economics is a theory, a simplified representation of how two or more variables interact with each other. So if I move this lever, what happens to this side, right? If I change interest rates, what happens to inflation? And economics has lots of theories. We have theories about wages, labor, employment, housing, inflation, trade, taxes, anything you could think of. We probably have an economic theory for it, right? A good theory should be simple enough to understand, but complex enough to capture all the important features of the situation or the object that you're studying. And so when we think about a theory, we don't want it to be so complicated that you can't understand it, but it has to be complex enough to really capture the information and really capture what's going on in the real world, because the real world is very complex. Economists use models to test theories. But we'll generally in this class, for our purposes, use model and theory a little bit interchangeably. And the basic idea here is what we're trying to do is simplify reality. So when you think about a model, think about a map, Google Maps or Apple Map, right? There's the zoomed in version where you've got the most complex realistic view. But most of the time, that's not the most important view of the map. What you really want is a zoomed out version. How do I get from A to B? And that's a model, right? It's a simplification of reality. It's give me the most important information while still giving me enough information to figure out point A to point B. And that's a way to think about theories and models, is that it's like a zoomed out version of a map. I don't need to know how many trees are on the block in the middle of my path. If I'm, going across town, I just want to know the general route where my lefts and right-hand turns are. And that's what a model is. It's a zoomed out picture of complex reality, a simplified version of complex reality. Cool? Hopefully that makes sense. Economists often use math and graphs to help them model those theories. And hopefully that's not intimidating. If it is, I promise, me and my whiteboard, we will get you through it together slowly but surely. Okay? Sound good? Cool. One of the simplest models, and this is a great example of an economic model, is what's known as the circular flow diagram. And that's this guy right here. The circular flow diagram shows how households and firms interact in the market for goods and services and the labor market. And so what we have are some assumptions. Our first assumption is that it's a closed economy, right? So this circular flow diagram is supposed to encapsulate a whole economy. And we only have two actors. We have households and firms. And the households and firms are going to interact in two markets, the labor market and the market for goods and services. In the labor market, households are going to lend their labor to firms and earn wages, salaries, and benefits, right? So that's a cycle, right? Firms give us money, we give them our time. We do not go to work for free, right? We get something out of it. So that's the labor market's ring, and that's that inner ring here. See, households give their labor and services to firms, and firms give households wages and salaries. The next thing that happens is, what are we going to do with our wages and salaries? We're going to buy stuff. So we're going to buy goods and services from those same companies and give them payment, and that's this outer ring. So when we buy goods and services, firms are going to expect payment for those goods and services from us. And that's that other transition. And so the idea is, and again, this is obviously super simplified and a little depressing because it's like, oh, well, I only go to work to give the company back money to buy stuff. But that is what we do, right? We go to work, we get money, and then we turn around and we spend that money on stuff. And so households are trading their labor for goods and services, and money is cycling through. And so this is another example. This is a great example of a simple model of complex reality. The real world is way more complex. There's things like taxes and saving. None of this is built into the model. This model is just a super simple example of one way of looking at an economy. Does that make sense? So we have two entities, we have two markets, and we have money and goods and services and labor cycling through the economy. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, hit up the discussion thread and let me know. Last section is how to organize economies. And so this is where we have an overview of economic systems. And there are at least three big overarching primary ways that societies organize an economy. The first is what's known as a traditional economy. And traditional economies are typically an agricultural economy where things are done the same way they've been done for 1,000 years. We see this as the sort of oldest, most traditional economic system. It tends to be, you kind of consume whatever you make, so it's sort of subsistence level economy. Occupations tend to stay in the family. We see this a lot in the less developed world and in what's called the global south, Asia, Africa, South America. And because there's not a lot of specialization in a traditional agrarian society, there's not a lot of economic progress or development. We're not taking advantage of that specialization we talked about earlier. The next example is what's known as a command economy. And this is an economy where economic decisions are passed down from a government authority and where the government owns the resources. And so in this case, the government makes a lot of the economic decisions. The government decides what goods and services to produce, what prices should be charged, how we should be producing them, what workers should be compensated, how much wages they should earn for their work. And then the government produces necessities like education and healthcare, sometimes for free. And so in this situation, in a command economy, the government has a lot of control over what's going on in the economy, is really setting the stage and setting the rules for the economy. The third example, or in this case, we have, so the examples of these command economies are going to be things like communist economies, things like North Korea, where the government tells you what job to do and how much money to make. We can think about monarchies or situations where there's a king in ancient Egypt or in medieval life where one person makes all the decisions about who does what in the economy. It's not as common, and it's, again, not considered super productive by economists. There aren't a lot of great examples of command economies being so successful. The last kind of economy is what we consider a market economy, and this is what economists love. It's a system where economic decisions are decentralized. Private individuals own their resources, businesses and supply goods and services and goods are based on demand. And so if you think about a command system as being a top-down decision where someone up top makes choices, market economy is bottom-up, where individual decisions make the choices about, or make the decisions about how much goods cost, what the demand is, and that kind of thing. And so in a market economy, markets determine prices and demand and supply. And we will talk about this a lot because this is the economic ideal. And this is what we see a lot of times. So if you ever try to buy something really popular, if you were trying to buy concert tickets this summer and the prices went up because so many people wanted them, that's an example of a market economy. Lots of demand driving up prices. And we'll explain why and how that works this semester. A market is anywhere where potential buyers and sellers are interacting with a combination of supply and demand. So you can think about a farmer's market being a market. You can think about eBay being a market, or Amazon being a market, Etsy, thinking about grocery stores and malls being markets. Anywhere where you're seeing buyers and sellers interact and make decisions about goods and services is a market. Private enterprise is a system where private individuals or groups of individuals own and operate the means of production. And the means of production is a really common economics term, which is just basically saying how things get made, the factories, the machinery, that kind of thing. And so in private enterprise, we see private individuals owning things rather than the government, and that's sort of the alternative. And so, like I said, a market economy is what economists prefer. It's not usually not 100% a free market. There's usually some government intervention, but it is what we see being the most efficient and the most conducive to economic growth. Most economies in the real world are actually mixed. They combine elements of command economies, traditional and market systems. The US is much more market-oriented than a lot of other economies, but most larger economies, especially successful economies, do have a pretty market-oriented economic system. Some countries have more government involvement than others, and we see really a true spectrum around the world of different economic systems. And that's one of the really interesting things for economists, is that means that we get to go around and see how successful these systems are, measure the differences, and compare and contrast to continually answer the question, what's the best way to organize economic activity? So in terms of sort of the rules of the games of regulation, there is no such thing as an absolutely free market. It's a fallacy, right? We have to have some public goods, and we'll talk about that in this class. Why are there some public goods? Why is there always some role for the government in the economy? Regulations, usually put forth by the government, will define the rules of the game in an economy. So, can I call myself a doctor? No, there are regulations about who gets to say they're a doctor or perform surgeries, right? There are rules about who can produce food and who can produce cars and what kind of cars can be on the road, right? So those regulations help define the rules of the economy. Economies that are more market-oriented tend to have fewer regulations, and ideally, like sort of the pure economic version would be just enough regulation to make sure that things are fair and safe, and then let the market take over the rest. Heavily regulated economies often have what are called underground economies or shadow markets or black markets. And the idea is if you have too much regulation, you create an incentive to sell things outside of the regulated area. So think about situations where there's prohibition. For example, when alcohol was illegal in the United States, It created a huge market for illegal alcohol. And so we see that the more regulation there is, the more often there's an incentive for someone to create a shadow market or an underground economy. And so that creates what we call inefficiencies. What else is going on in the economy in our overview is we see the rise of globalization. Globalization is just the buying and selling of markets across national borders. And this is a big thing, and it's not going away. And part of that comes back to this idea of specialization. When countries specialize just like individuals do, we tend to see economies get more productive and the size of the global market grow. Globalization necessarily means we have exports and imports. Exports are goods that we produce and sell abroad, and imports are goods and services that are produced abroad and sold domestically. And then GDP, or gross domestic product, measures the total size of the final goods and services produced within a country within a period of time. And so it's a measure of the strength of a single economy for a single country. The global economy is part of what has been driving all of the great levels of growth and productivity that we see in the world these days. So think about what are some examples of the products and services in the modern economy and how they contribute to globalization. How does internet contribute to globalization? How do you participate in globalization? And is it preferable to the alternative, right? I always argue I like really cheap stuff. And so globalization helps me get the lowest cost goods in the world. And that's a pretty great privilege. So that is chapter 1. You made it through the first chapter. There's a lot of terminology, and we'll keep talking about those terms as they come up. But for now, you are set to complete your assignments in Module 1. Hit up the discussion thread. Let me know what questions you have, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.